My brother called me on a Tuesday morning while I was finishing a 12-hour overnight shift. I was still in my uniform, smelling like antiseptic and coffee, standing outside the ER bay with my partner when his name lit up my screen. I answered, expecting to hear about the holiday dinner plans. Instead, he told me not to come. He said it quickly, like pulling off a bandage. Like speed made it hurt less. The engagement party was in 3 weeks. His fiancée's family would be there. Her father ran one of the largest commercial real estate firms on the East Coast. Her mother sat on the boards of 3 nonprofits. And me, his little sister, showing up as a paramedic who drove an ambulance and worked nights and lived in a rented 2-bedroom in South Philly, would send the wrong message about our family. "It's not about you," he said. "It's just optics." I stood there watching an ambulance pull out of the bay. I had just spent the last 2 hours trying to keep a 63-year-old man alive after a heart attack. I had held his hand while his wife cried in the waiting room. I had done my job, the way I always did my job, and now my brother was telling me that job made me an embarrassment. "Okay," I said. He paused, clearly expecting a fight. "You're not upset?" I didn't say that. "Rachel, enjoy the party," I told him. "Tell Victoria." I said congratulations. I hung up. My partner Marcus raised an eyebrow at me from across the bay. He had been my partner for 6 years and knew me better than most people. I just shook my head and walked back inside. There was paperwork to finish. What my brother didn't know, what none of my family knew, was that 3 months earlier, I had sat across from a lawyer named Gerald Finch in a quiet office in Center City, Philadelphia, and learned that my life had changed completely. I just hadn't told anyone yet. I was waiting for them to show me who they really were first. I had learned that from Uncle Harold. He had always been the family's background character. My mother's older brother, retired facilities manager, meaning he had spent 30 years maintaining the buildings of a downtown Philadelphia office complex. He wore the same brand of work boots for 2 decades. He drove a Ford pickup so old it had a cassette player. At every family gathering, he sat in the corner, drank 1 beer, listened more than he spoke, and left before 9 because he liked to be in bed by 10. My cousin and I called him Quiet Harold when we were kids, not meanly, just accurately. He never corrected us. My mother stopped inviting him to things after a while. "He doesn't add anything to the conversation," she said once, forgetting I was in the room. "He just sits there looking like he works at a gas station." He worked at a gas station once. He told me that himself. When he was 19, 2 years after dropping out of high school, before he found his footing. He told me a lot of things during the last 3 years of his life, when I drove to his apartment in Northeast Philly every Sunday, and had coffee with him because he was the only member of my family who had ever asked me genuine questions about my work and actually listened to the answers. He had gotten sick quietly, the same way he did everything. Kidney failure, slow, and then fast. He didn't want anyone making a fuss. He asked me to be his healthcare proxy because, he said, "You're the only one who understands how medical decisions actually work, and because I trust your judgment, Rachel. You've always had good judgment. Even when you were 7 years old and you told your mother that dog was scared before it bit your cousin, and nobody listened." I drove him to his appointments. I sat with him through dialysis. We talked about his life, which turned out to be far more interesting than anyone in our family had ever bothered to find out. He had started buying property at 32, a small row house, then another. He'd read every book he could find on real estate investment and had spent 3 decades doing it quietly, methodically, reinvesting every dollar, never showing off because, as he put it, people who show off what they have are usually trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else. By the time he died at 71, he owned 14 properties, 2 commercial, 12 residential, all paid off, all managed through a small LLC he had set up with Gerald Finch's help 20 years ago. The total value sat just under $12 million. He left it to me, all of it, with conditions attached, written into his trust in language that was precise and specific in a way that told me he had spent a long time thinking about exactly who might come looking after he was gone. Gerald Finch had read me the relevant clause in a steady, professional voice. The inheritance shall transfer in full only if the primary beneficiary, Rachel Marie Calloway, remains professionally active in a service-based occupation. If at any point a family member deliberately excludes Rachel from a family event, gathering, or milestone on the basis of her profession or income level, and this exclusion is documented, the excluded party forfeits any secondary claim to the estate permanently. He had looked up from the documents then. Your uncle was very specific, Gerald said. He always was, I told him. I had kept it secret for 3 months. I went to work. I ran calls. I covered shifts for colleagues going through hard times. I showed up to Sunday dinners at my mother's house and listened to her talk about my brother Daniel's fiancée Victoria, as though she were the second coming, so polished, so connected, such a wonderful family. I sat quietly, and I waited. The engagement party happened without me. I know this because my cousin sent me photos through a private message with the caption, "Why aren't you here?" I responded, "Scheduling conflict." She sent back a string of question marks. I didn't answer. 3 days after the party, my mother called. She didn't start with hello. She started with, "Victoria's father wants to meet the whole family before the wedding. He's hosting a dinner at their house in Bryn Mawr next month. I need to know you're going to behave." What does behave mean? It means don't bring up your job unless someone asks. It means dress appropriately. It means don't make things awkward. Who told you to call me about this? Silence. Then, Daniel thought it would be better coming from me. So my brother couldn't even make the call himself. He had sent our mother to manage me, the same way they had always managed me carefully, from a distance, as though I were something slightly unpredictable that might embarrass them if not handled correctly. "I'll think about it," I said. "Rachel, this is important to your brother." I said I'll think about it. I didn't go to that dinner either. I picked up a shift instead. I sent Daniel a text that said, "I hope it went well." He replied 12 hours later, "It did. Mom said you couldn't make it." Yeah, I couldn't. The gap between us had always been there. It had just gotten easier to see. Daniel was 4 years older than me. He had gone to Penn State on a partial scholarship, gotten an MBA, and worked in corporate finance. He wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent, and drove a lease he updated every 3 years. He was not unkind by nature. He was just someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the version of success he was building required a certain kind of story, and I did not fit neatly into that story. He had started pulling away from me slowly, around the time he met Victoria. She was not cruel, exactly. She was simply someone who had grown up in a world where everyone she knew did a certain type of work, lived in a certain type of house, and vacationed in a certain type of place, and anyone who fell outside those parameters was processed with polite discomfort, like a piece of furniture in the wrong room. At Thanksgiving, which I had been invited to, barely, and had attended in my civilian clothes, and not mentioned work, once Victoria had asked what I did in the careful tone of someone already bracing for disappointment. When I told her, she had nodded, and said, "Oh, that's so noble," with a smile that meant the conversation was over. Noble. The word they use when they mean, "Good for you, I suppose. But let's talk about something else." My mother had laughed too quickly and redirected toward Daniel's latest project. I had eaten my green beans and said nothing. Now it was late November, almost a year since that Thanksgiving, and my brother's wedding was set for the following April. I had not been asked to be in the bridal party. Victoria had explained, through Daniel, that she had a large group of close friends and the numbers just didn't work out. I had not been asked to do a reading or help with planning or weigh in on the venue. I had received an invitation in the mail, addressed in calligraphy, the same as the 200 other guests who were strangers to me. The invitation included a card for the rehearsal dinner. At the bottom of that card, someone had handwritten a small note in blue pen. I recognized my sister-in-law-to-be's handwriting from the birthday card she'd sent last year. The note said, "This is the formal family dinner. We'd prefer if you could sit this one out. Daniel agrees it's for the best." Please understand. I read it twice. Then I took a photo of it. Then I put it in a folder inside the filing cabinet in my spare bedroom, next to the documents from Gerald Finch's office. I texted Gerald that evening. He responded within the hour. The following morning, I called him and explained what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Your uncle anticipated something like this. He was quite clear about documentation." He paused. "I'll need the photo and the original note. I'll also need a brief written account of the engagement party exclusion from 3 weeks ago. I have text from my brother. Is that sufficient? Even better. I sent him everything that night. My brother called me 2 days later. He sounded different, tighter, like something was coiling inside him. He said that Victoria's father, a man named Richard Voss, had personally requested that I attend the wedding rehearsal dinner after all. Not just attend, he wanted to meet me beforehand. One-on-one, if possible." "Why?" Daniel asked me, and I heard something underneath the question that sounded almost like fear. "I have no idea," I said. This was not entirely true. Richard Voss had called Gerald Finch's office 5 days earlier. I don't know how he found out about the trust. I suspected his people did due diligence on the entire Calloway family before his daughter married into it, the way people in his position often did. Gerald had not confirmed or denied anything. He had simply told me that a Richard Voss had been inquiring about Harold Calloway's estate. I agreed to meet him. We had coffee at a hotel lobby in Center City on a Thursday morning. He was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the kind of hands that told you he had not always been the man who signed the checks. He stood when I arrived and shook my hand firmly. "Your uncle was Harold Calloway," he said, not as a question. He was. I knew of him. Not personally, but his properties. He owned the Alcott Street commercial building for almost 20 years. I tried to buy it from him twice. He shook his head slightly. He always said no. Said he liked watching people build things in it. A small smile. Good man. He was. Richard Voss looked at me for a moment. "My daughter doesn't know I'm here," I assumed. "She's not a bad person," he said. "She grew up in a particular environment. I hold myself responsible for some of that." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I grew up in Kensington. My father worked in a textile factory. My first job was pouring concrete at construction sites. I was 22 years old, and I made $8 an hour, and I was glad to have it." He looked up. "I don't think I've done a good enough job of making sure Victoria understands where we came from." I didn't say anything. Sometimes the best thing you can do is stay quiet and let people say what they actually mean. "I've been told," he continued carefully, "that you were asked not to attend the rehearsal dinner." "That's correct. I was not consulted on that decision." I gathered. He nodded slowly. "There's an event I host every year. The Voss Foundation Benefit Dinner. It's in 3 weeks. 250 guests, press coverage, the works. I'd like you to attend as my personal guest. I think some things need to be said in front of the right audience." He slid a card across the table. "I'd also like to formally meet with Gerald Finch next week about a partnership initiative, if you're open to that." I picked up the card. "Can I ask you something first?" "Of course. Why does the public setting matter to you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because my daughter has been telling her friends that her future sister-in-law is," he paused, "a burden the family has to accommodate. Those friends have families. Those families have networks. I've heard things I should not have had to hear." He met my eyes. "My father drove a bus for 40 years. I will not have his granddaughter build her life on that kind of contempt." I told him I'd be there. The next 3 weeks moved strangely. My brother called twice, once to tell me that Victoria's rehearsal dinner note had been a misunderstanding, once to ask if I was planning anything that might make the family look bad. I told him I was planning to attend a charity benefit. He seemed satisfied with this, and stopped calling. My mother texted to say she'd heard I was going to some foundation dinner, and was I sure I had something appropriate to wear. I told her I did. She sent 3 more messages about it. I stopped responding after the second one. My cousin, the one who had sent me the party photos, called me from her car on a Sunday evening. Something is happening, she said. I don't know what, but your name keeps coming up in conversations that go quiet when I walk in. She paused. Are you okay? I'm better than okay, I said. That's either very reassuring or very alarming. Probably both. She laughed, uncertain. I had always loved her, for the way she stayed curious instead of afraid. The night of the benefit dinner, I wore a dark green dress I had owned for 2 years and never had occasion to wear. My friend Claudia, who worked dispatch and had the kind of calm competence that should be illegal, drove over and helped me with my hair. She had been my closest friend since my first year on the job. She knew about the trust, about Gerald, about all of it. She was one of 3 people I had told. You ready for this? She asked, watching me in the mirror. I've kept a man breathing with my hands for 6 minutes on the floor of a convenience store, I said. I can handle a dinner. She smiled, different kind of pressure. Same principle. Just don't stop. The Voss Foundation dinner was held at a restored ballroom in Center City. When I arrived, Gerald Finch was already there, standing near the entrance in a dark suit. He shook my hand and said, Your brother and his fiancée are here, so is your mother. A beat. They arrived 30 minutes ago. Victoria has been telling several board members that she expects to announce a new family partnership with the foundation tonight. I almost laughed. Even now, she was building the story she wanted to tell. Richard knows, Gerald added. He's ready. I walked in through the side entrance the way Richard had suggested. The room was beautiful warm lighting, round tables, flowers I couldn't name. I recognized some faces from the nonprofit world, a few city officials, a journalist from the Inquirer I had seen at a press conference once. 250 people who had all come to the same room, without knowing they were about to witness something none of them had put on their calendars. Across the room I spotted my brother. He was standing with Victoria and her mother near the bar, looking at ease in his element, the kind of ease you can only manufacture after years of practice. Victoria was in ivory. She looked stunning, and she knew it. My mother stood slightly to their left, holding a champagne flute, and watching the room with the expression she used at events she was trying to navigate. None of them had seen me yet. I found my table. Richard Voss was already seated, with Gerald on his left. He stood when I approached and said, quietly, Thank you for being here. Then he introduced me to the 3 people beside him, foundation board members, 2 women and a man who had each been working in community development for longer than I had been alive. They greeted me with the kind of warmth that told me Richard had already spoken to them about who I was. I was finishing my water when Victoria saw me. I watched it happen in slow motion the moment her eyes found me, then moved to her father, then back to me, then to Gerald Finch, and something behind her expression shifted. Not quite recognition, more like recalculation. She leaned toward my brother and said something quickly. He looked up, found me, and his face went through 4 expressions in 2 seconds. He excused himself from their group and walked over. He crouched slightly when he reached my table, the way people do when they want a private conversation in a public room. Rachel, he said. What is this? Richard invited me, I said, months ago. Why? You'd have to ask him. Is something going on that I should know about? I looked at him, my brother, who I had grown up with, who I had defended in a school fight when he was 11 and I was 7, who had once driven 3 hours through a snowstorm to help me move apartments, and never asked for anything in return, who had spent the last 2 years slowly handing me over to a version of his life that had no room for me in it. I felt the full weight of what he had chosen, and I felt something else underneath it that might have been grief. Yes, I said. But you're going to hear it the same time everyone else does. He went pale. He went back to Victoria. Richard Voss called the room to order at 8:30. He was a good speaker, unhurried, direct, the kind of authority that doesn't need volume. He thanked everyone for attending. He talked briefly about the foundation's work. And then he said he had a special announcement to make about a new partnership, and he turned to me. Most of you came here tonight knowing about the Voss Foundation, he said. Some of you may not know about the Harold Calloway Community Trust, which has been operating quietly in this city for almost 3 decades. He paused. Harold Calloway was a facilities manager. He drove a used truck. He wore work boots to his nephew's graduation. And he built, completely without fanfare, one of the most thoughtfully structured private charitable trusts I have encountered in 30 years of philanthropic work. Murmurs moved through the room. Harold passed away this past year. He left his entire estate to his niece, Rachel Calloway. Richard turned to me. Rachel is a paramedic with the Philadelphia Fire Department. She has worked in emergency services for 7 years. She has been, by every account, an extraordinary one. More murmurs. I heard my mother make a sound across the room that I couldn't identify. Richard nodded at me. I stood. I had written my remarks on index cards, and then not looked at them again after the third draft, because if I couldn't say it from memory by now, I didn't know it well enough. I walked to the small podium, and I looked out at 250 people, and I thought of Uncle Harold sitting in the corner at family dinners with his one beer, listening more than he spoke, and I said, "My uncle used to tell me that most people are only ever seen by the people who choose to look. He said the rest of the world operates on assumptions, and the assumptions we make about each other based on what we do for work, how much we earn, what neighborhood we come from. Those assumptions are the most expensive mistake most families ever make." I let that sit for a moment. 3 weeks ago, I was asked not to attend my brother's rehearsal dinner because my job as a paramedic was considered, and I'll quote directly, not the right image for the family they were building. I kept my voice steady. That request was put in writing. And because my uncle was a very careful man who had watched our family for a long time, it triggered a clause in his trust that I've been sitting on for 3 months. I heard a sharp intake of breath from the direction of the bar. "Victoria, I'm not here to embarrass anyone," I said, and I meant it. I am here because my uncle left me something more valuable than real estate, and that was a clear set of instructions about what kind of person deserved to steward it. He believed that people who look down on work, real work, the kind that keeps other people alive, should not be trusted with money meant to lift people up. Gerald Finch rose from his seat and addressed the room briefly, the way lawyers do, calm, methodical, devastating in the precision of every word. He explained the trust structure. He explained the clause. He produced the documentation, the written note from Victoria, the text chain with my brother, the record of the engagement party exclusion. He stated, without dramatics, that as of 30 days ago, any secondary claims to Harold Calloway's estate had been permanently forfeited. "The total value of the trust," Gerald said, "is $11,800,000. My brother sat down very slowly, like the air had left his body. Victoria stood up. "This is manipulation," she said, and her voice was clear and controlled, the voice of someone who had been raised to perform in public. She isolated an elderly man and convinced him to cut his own family out of. "Mr. Calloway's cognitive assessments are on file for the final 4 years of his life," Gerald said. "All scores fell within normal range for his age. His physician is available to speak to that." A pause. Additionally, Rachel Calloway was not the only person named in the trust. There were 6 other individuals, all former colleagues of Mr. Calloway, all of whom had maintained contact with him over the years. None of them are blood relatives. Victoria's mother put a hand on her arm. Victoria sat down. Richard Voss stepped back to the podium. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "I've known about this situation for 3 weeks. I requested Rachel's presence tonight not to humiliate my daughter, but because I believe in accountability in public the same way my father believed in it, the same way every person in this room who has ever done honest work and been made to feel small for it deserves to see it named for what it is." He looked at my brother. "Daniel, I still want you to marry my daughter. I want that genuinely. But I need you to understand, and I need her to understand, that the life I built did not start in a boardroom. It started on a job site in Kensington at 5 in the morning with a thermos of bad coffee and a pair of steel-toed boots. The woman you excluded from your dinner does the same kind of work that kept my father going when his knee gave out in 2009. You will not treat that as something to be managed." The room was quiet in the way that only happens when 250 people are all trying not to move. My brother looked at me from across the tables. I couldn't read his expression fully. It was too many things at once. I went back to the microphone for the last part. The Harold Calloway Community Trust will fund 3 initiatives going forward, I said. The first is a housing assistance grant for emergency responders, paramedics, EMTs, firefighters who are priced out of the cities they serve. The second is a workforce development fund for people transitioning out of labor-intensive careers due to injury. The third is an educational scholarship for first-generation students pursuing healthcare or emergency services. I paused. My uncle believed the people society depends on most are the ones it rewards least. This is my attempt to take that seriously. Applause. Real applause, not polite applause. I found my seat. Gerald leaned over and said quietly, "Your uncle would be disgusted by all the attention, and privately delighted." I laughed, and it was the first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks. My mother found me 20 minutes later, near the window, while the room was moving into dessert. She looked smaller than I was used to. Her posture was different, less arranged. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't. About the trust. About what Harold had." She stopped. "He was just Harold. He was always more than that. We just didn't look." She was quiet. "Then, I should have called you more." I didn't answer immediately, because I had learned from my uncle that the truest things deserve a moment before you speak them. "Yeah," I said finally. "You should have." She nodded. She didn't make excuses, which was new. I took note of it. My brother came to find me as people were beginning to leave. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. He stood with his hands in his pockets and said, "I don't know how to start." "You don't have to start tonight," I told him. "I handled this wrong." "You did. Victoria." "This isn't about Victoria," I said. "Or not only about her. You made your own choices, Daniel. She didn't make them for you." I looked at him. "You sent Mom to call me. You put a note in a rehearsal dinner card instead of calling me yourself. Those were your decisions." He looked at the floor. "I know. I'm not going away," I told him. "I'm your sister. I'm going to be your sister at your wedding. And after your wedding, and for the rest of our lives. But I won't keep pretending I'm something that needs to be managed." I paused. "Neither will I keep pretending it's fine when it isn't." He met my eyes. "What do you need from me?" "Honesty. And a real conversation. Not through Mom, not through a card. Just you and me, the way it used to be." He nodded slowly. I recognized the nod, the one that meant he was actually listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak. It was the same nod he used to give me when we were kids, and he was deciding whether something I said was worth taking seriously. This time, it looked like he had decided it was. Victoria avoided me for the rest of the evening. I didn't seek her out. There would be time for that conversation, or there wouldn't. That would be her choice. Richard Voss shook my hand at the door and said he hoped we would talk more about the housing grant. His wife, a quiet woman with direct eyes, told me Harold sounded like a remarkable person. I said he was. Claudia was parked outside. I got into the passenger seat and sat there for a moment without speaking. "How'd it go?" she asked. "The way it needed to. That good or that bad?" "Both," I said. "Like most things that matter." She pulled out into traffic, and I watched the city move past the window, the corner stores and the row houses and the streetlights, doing their ordinary work of making the dark easier to see in. Somewhere out there, my uncle's properties stood on their foundations, the way they had for decades, filled with people building their lives inside them, and none of those people had ever known his name. That was the thing about Harold. He had never needed them to. The months that followed were complicated in the ways that anything real usually is. My brother and I had 3 long phone calls and 1 dinner that went until midnight, and we said things we had been not saying for years, and it was uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. Victoria came to one of those dinners. She was guarded and formal and said very little, but she came, which I counted for something. My mother started calling me on Sundays. Not every Sunday, but most of them. She asked questions about my work, real questions, not the polite kind. She asked once what the hardest call I ever ran was, and when I told her, she cried, and I realized she had never actually known before what I was going out to face. Gerald Finch filed all the necessary paperwork, and the trust transferred without contest. I hired a property manager for the residential units, and we adjusted the rents to below market for tenants already in place. Nobody was displaced. Harold had taken care of that too, in his careful way, in clauses Gerald had explained to me the first day we met. The Inquirer ran a piece about the trust and the foundation partnership. The headline called me a blue-collar philanthropist, which made me laugh for a full minute in the break room at work, and then I cut it out and taped it to my locker. The housing grant program launched in the spring. We funded 31 emergency responders in the first round, people who had been commuting 90 minutes each way because they couldn't afford to live where they worked. At the launch event, a paramedic from North Philly named Darius gave a short speech. He had been sleeping on a friend's couch for 4 months. The grant let him sign a lease. He said 3 sentences and then stopped because he couldn't continue, and everyone in that room understood exactly why. I put his thank you letter in a folder I kept in my desk at home. I labeled it the same way my uncle had always labeled things that mattered, plainly, without ceremony. I wrote, "Why this matters," and then I kept going. The work was not glamorous. The press coverage faded after a few weeks. I still ran 12-hour shifts. I still smelled like antiseptic at the end of them. I still drove a car with 200,000 miles on it, because the money was not mine to spend on myself. It never had been. Harold had understood that before I did, which was why he chose me, instead of someone who would have needed the reminder. At my brother's wedding in April, I sat in the 3rd row. Victoria had not asked me to be in the bridal party. She had, however, asked me to give a reading, which was more than I had expected from her, and I did it well, I thought. At the reception, Richard Voss danced with his daughter in a way that made it clear he had loved her longer and harder than she had made it easy for him to, and that he intended to keep doing it anyway. I understood that. My mother drank 2 glasses of champagne and told 3 separate people, unprompted, that her daughter was a paramedic and had recently started one of the most innovative first responder housing initiatives in the state. She said it the way people say things they have just learned to be proud of. A little louder than necessary, with the energy of someone making up for lost time. I didn't correct her volume. I let her have it. After the reception, Claudia and I sat on the steps outside the venue and split a piece of wedding cake with plastic forks she had pocketed from the dessert table. The night was warm for April. Somewhere behind us, the music was still going. "Your uncle would have hated this party," she said. "Oh, completely," I agreed. "Too many flowers. Too loud. He would have left at 9. Do you think he knew it would go like this?" I thought about it. I thought about Harold sitting in corner chairs with his 1 beer, watching, the way he watched everything, not passively, but with the kind of attention that looks like stillness from the outside. I thought about the documents he had spent years preparing, the clauses he had written in anticipation of exactly the kind of small cruelty families practice on their own. "He knew something," I said. "He always knew something." I ate the last bit of cake. He just waited to see if he was right. Was he? I looked out at the city, the lights of it, the noise of it, all those people moving through their lives with their ordinary and extraordinary burdens, and I thought of Darius with his lease, and the 30 people who had a home because of a man none of them had ever met, a man who had worn the same work boots for 20 years, and watched the world from corner chairs and decided, quietly and without fanfare, that the right person to hold something was the one who would know what it was for. "Yeah," I said. "He was right." Claudia nodded. We sat there until the music stopped, and then we drove home through the city that my uncle had loved without ever saying so out loud, which was, I had come to understand, exactly how he loved everything steadily, without announcement, and for a very long time.